spend every week in the heart of Minneapolis trying to deal with some of the most difficult issues that plague our inner city. And one of the biggest problems that we have when we talk about this divide is there is a lack of trust, at least amongst some, when you separate between urban, suburban, and greater Minnesota. I actually think there's almost a three-way split in this state. And I think having somebody who has lived and worked in each of those areas is a way to bridge that divide and hopefully gain some trust that other leaders might not have, because I think it's absolutely possible.
Erin?
It is wonderful to be with you tonight. I want to begin with a confession. I was born in a little town in southern Wisconsin. My dad was born in Gays Mills, Wisconsin, so if you're in the southeastern part of the state, you cross over to Wisconsin. You're in his neck of the woods. So I have my own roots in a small community. Grew up in Janesville, worked in Marshfield, Wisconsin, rural community, before I came here to practice nursing at the University of Minnesota. I'm not so sure my zip code is the matter. I've spent 12 years in elected office, 12 years traveling the state, spending my time with the people of Minnesota. First, because I was curious, wanted to learn how things were done in different parts of the state, especially thinking about healthcare in our public schools. But as I have campaigned across the state, I have spent my time with the people of Minnesota all over the state, and frankly, I think that's the best preparation to do the job of being the governor for the state of Minnesota. When I listen to people, Minnesotans, they're not talking so much about the urban and rural divide as much as they are saying the thing that matters to me, to my community, what's happening here where I live is being neglected. That's true in North Minneapolis. That's true on the east side of St. Paul. It's true in Blaine. It's true in rural communities that dot the landscape across the state of Minnesota. That's because the dysfunction inside the state capitol, and certainly the dysfunction in Washington, D.C. And when we use our politics to try and beat the other side, when we use our politics to try and win the next election and not focus on Minnesotans' future, people feel left behind by that. That's what we need to tackle. That's what I want to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. Next question is for you, Jeff. One of the next governor's first tasks is to put together a budget and have that ready to go, and we'll submit to the legislature for their consideration. The current revenue collections look pretty good, and they're strong, but there's also a lot of uncertainty in Minnesota's fiscal outlook. What would be the priorities in your first budget as governor, and when it comes to taxes and spending? And then secondly, what are the programs that you think we ought to have more money spent on, and those that maybe we should not be spending?
So I can tell you, first of all, just before I talk about the specifics, I'm going to be a very, very involved, engaged, and active governor in this whole process from the start of the session. Not at the end of the session, but from day one. And frankly, for me, it'll be day one as governor-elect, and the first thing I'll start working on with both parties is to try to figure out this tax conformity issue that blew up at the end of the session, because I think that has to be our top priority. With respect to the budget, my priorities have always been, whether I'm on the county board or in the House or now as governor coming up, will be K-12 education, because our Constitution requires that. It will be transportation, and it will be a safety net for the most vulnerable people in our society. What should we spend more money on? I'm not sure that I can name anything other than possibly roads and bridges. I happen to believe that we spend too much money right now as a state. We've seen a 53% increase in state spending in 8 years. I don't believe that is sustainable. Where do we actually reduce spending going forward? I can probably name a few areas, but the area that stands out the most is our human service spending. Because when you compare Minnesota to similar states in demography and in size and in population, that is the one area where we are completely out of whack with similar states. And I believe that we can have the strongest safety net in America, but do so a bit more affordably than we are now.
When I was the majority leader in 2013 and 14, we put Minnesota's budget back together again. When Tim Pawlenty was our governor, he drove the budget into the ground and really harmed the state's economy, and you experienced that, many of you did, in communities across the state, especially when we cut LGA and higher education. We didn't invest in transportation. So in 2013 and 14 with Governor Dayton, we put that budget back together again. I've got a lot of experience with the budget and I'm ready to do this job. With a budget that is balanced structurally, which we have right now, with a modest surplus, we can begin to do the work to plan our future. And when I decided to run for governor, it is because when I look ahead, we have some real challenges that we need to tackle. We need to make sure people have access to affordable health care, and we've got to rein in costs at the same time. We have to invest in our schools across the state because we haven't caught up with 2003 and inflation. We have to invest in transportation and roads and bridges and broadband. I announced a plan yesterday to fully finish the job on broadband. And one thing I want to make sure you know from me, we're going to open up regional offices, 8 of them, when I'm the governor. Because it's time for us to stitch each other back together again. It's time to pull us back together again. And it's time to make sure that Minnesotans are connected. And one way to do that is to make sure the state government is connected with the people of the state of Minnesota.
We have to change how we do our budgeting. We have to make sure we don't end up in the last 12 hours of a session where we have 800-page document sprung on people. What we'll do, and what my pledge to you as governor is, we've already started this with One Minnesota Community Prosperity Act. We're bringing in mayors. I have 4 co-chairs that are working this. The mayor of Minneapolis, the mayors, suburban mayors. We have Fergus Falls mayor, and we have our tribal leaders up on Mille Lacs. The idea that we should do is we should design a budget around what our needs are. We're asking the wrong question when we just say we're spending too much. How do we know? How have we made the decisions? Are we spending enough, or are we spending the right amount? And when we talk about the priorities, the simple priority with this administration, you're seeing this partnership work in how I picked a running mate in Peggy Flanagan, former director of the Children's Defense Fund, Minneapolis school board member, suburban legislator, that you don't do these things on the back end. But we're going to make those investments in people, and it starts with education. I got asked what my radical idea about education was. Fund it. There's a radical idea for you, making sure the best quality teachers are in there based on the outcomes we have. But you don't do these things in pieces. Children don't come in pieces, states don't come in pieces. So when we talk about a transportation plan that works for all of us, with rural broadband, making sure we're investing in the case so that we can grow businesses, making sure that healthcare piece that everyone is covered, and we move to making sure we have a healthier population. But until we write the budget with the inclusion of everyone who's impacted, we'll get the same results. Under my administration, you will write it, and the leaders in this room will write it, understanding what that impact makes for their communities.
Aaron, you're next. The question. And you brought up LGA a moment ago. And LGA, the local government aid, supports communities throughout Minnesota. And it helps them helps us pay for public safety, libraries, streets, parks, and other services that residents rely on and also businesses rely on. LGA has been successful at narrowing disparities between communities and helps cities provide quality services while keeping the property tax rates reasonable. The question is, are you committed to making LGA a budget priority, and will you support a significant LGA increase?
I will, and I am committed to LGA and to an increase in LGA. I understand how important it is, local government aid. We all know what Tim Valenti did to LGA, and you know what happened in your communities as a result of that. And I had, as part of the responsibility of making sure we put that budget back together again with people like Tim Flaherty, to see out there, Tim Flaherty. So I know how important it is to our communities. It's lifeblood. So yes, I'm committed to it. We did some reform to the formula when I was the majority leader to make it a little bit more equitable across the state, to make sure that it was modernized, and yes, to an increase. Remember the Minnesota Miracle. The Minnesota Miracle was predicated on sharing the benefits and the burdens of the state's economy and the budget to make sure that across the state people had what they needed. That's the principle that I will use when I'm the governor, that we share together to make sure communities across the state have what they need, that we're not leaving people behind. And LGA, school funding, county program aid, those are our tools to make sure that that happens. I'm committed to that.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I agree with Erin. She's absolutely right. LGA is critical. It was smart. It's what Minnesota does and innovated. In 1971, when we put LGA in, local government aid, the idea is that there's disparities and there's different needs. For example, we may have to build a township bridge like we did in Pipestone County. that was $3.1 million and it served 15 families. Now, if you wanted to have a discussion on that, was it worth it? Could those families have gone around? You need to hear the rest of the story. Those 15 families feed 50,000 people. The bridge was built to specifications for agriculture out there. If you don't do balancing in how we do this, you have the haves and have-nots. You have school districts that have to go back to the voters locally with a diminished tax base, asking to raise property taxes to just fix a leaky roof, while they drive by schools that have domed stadiums and turf fields. My pledge to you is to bring back LGA to what it was in 2002, keeping it pace with inflation. You're going to get a chance. Jeff's going to get an answer. He was in the legislature in May of 2003 when they cut $150 million. At that point in time, LGA made up 4% of the general budget. It's not even 2% now. The people in this room are moving money closer to the projects and those essential things. And essential things in one community might be different from another community. It might mean fixing a wastewater treatment plant or building a child care facility. Or maybe even this, the idea that we might enhance our communities with a water park that makes a difference in quality of life so greater Minnesota is better. As your governor, we will get back to where we were, we will continue to invest, and we will make one Minnesota stronger together.
So I suspect I'm going to stand out a few times today, and this will be the start of it. I'm not going to make any promises to spend more money on anything because I don't think that's responsible. And, you know, I suspect that you'll hear lots of promises to spend more on everything that comes up today from the other two up here on stage. But we have seen a huge increase in spending, so I'm not running around the state saying everybody who asks me a question about more spending, yeah, we'll spend more, and then I'll have to figure out how to deal with it later. My understanding of the origination of LGA actually makes sense, and I support it. I've been told, at least, that it was created to help smaller communities, particularly in greater Minnesota, small and mid-sized communities, particularly in greater Minnesota, that had a tax base problem, that had trouble providing basic services without sending property taxes skyrocketing for their citizens. I think that actually makes sense, and I've always been supportive of local government aid. I don't think the formula does that anymore. And yes, some tweaks were made a few years ago that probably made it a little bit better, but the bulk of that money is going to the three biggest cities in this state. My city of Plymouth doesn't get LGA, and it shouldn't, because our city doesn't need it. We are able to provide what we can provide by taxing our people and our businesses. But I know small communities all over this state that need that help, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I will not make any promises, however, to increase the number. I can make you a promise that we will work more on the formula so that it serves those most in need.
Thank you. See, Tim, question for you now is on childcare. Because over the past several years, there's been a growing concern, and I'm on the board of Greater Mankato Growth, and we have good folks in this community that are working on making this place a good place for people to come work, live, and raise their families. But one of the things you run into is childcare. You got to have great schools, and we have terrific schools here. But the childcare is the big issue, and it seems to be throughout most of Minnesota. The question is, what's the state's role, as you would see it as governor, in addressing the shortage of childcare in greater Minnesota? And are there policies or programs that the state should adopt that will increase the supply of childcare?
This issue, and those of you who are a little older and don't remember this, and I'm out of that phase now, but remember, that's one of the most important decisions you make, of trying to find quality child care providers to take care of your children. I applaud Governor Dayton's move to making sure we move to universal pre-K. We need to make sure our children are ready to go. But what the question is on those pre-4-year-olds and how we make sure that we're getting them the quality care. One of the first things we can do is we can fully forecast and fund CCAP, the Child Care Assistance Program, to make sure we're not reimbursing at a rate that allows people to make this happen. One of the things in our Community Prosperity Act does, it allows the block granting, is the way this would work from the state with local matching. It allows the local communities to make the decision, and I fully anticipate there will be many communities who will use that to help build child care facilities. We can use tax rebates and tax incentives to employers who are trying to do the things that we know is the best for child development and happiest employees and best productivity, put child care into the workplace so that parents can take their kids. We've got folks driving 45 miles if they can find the child care that's out there. And this especially falls on communities of color, the equity piece of this, that trying to find an affordable child care while you're trying to work, barely making living on minimum wage, creates a discrepancy that leads to that opportunity gap in this state, which we'll talk about on education. 70% of the workforce in this state in the next 25 years comes from community of color. We need to make sure those children get the right start.
So I've always been supportive of our sliding scale for those who need help with child care, and I actually love the scholarship program that has been put forth the last few years, because I believe we should give parents choices rather than government saying, here's the child care you must have if we're gonna give you some benefits. Let the parents make that decision. So that's important to me. But I have to add that the biggest part of this problem was created by government. My sister has had in-home child care for 25 years, so I get an earful every time I go back up to Detroit Lakes about how government treats her. And we've been traveling around this state, including in Mankato, and we've probably talked to 100 either in-home child care providers or providers at smaller to mid-sized centers around this state in greater Minnesota. And some of them have left the business, and others are thinking about leaving the business. Not because they don't love their work, not even because they can't make ends meet, but because government is regulating them out of business. And we hear it over and over and over again. Most of them are women who are trying to provide a service in their community that people desperately want and need. But because of how they are treated by some within the Department of Human Services, they're leaving the business. And so while I do believe that we could probably do a better job with respect to the sliding scale and with scholarships, government needs to back off a little bit so that these people can provide the service they want to provide.
I was in New York Mills late last year to talk about their solution on childcare. And they taught me an important lesson, one that you already know, that different communities across the state face different challenges on a similar issue like childcare. They are a manufacturing community, lots of jobs, people who want to take those jobs but can't find childcare because they have a childcare desert there. For 2 years, Head Start teachers, local elected city councilors, the county commissioner, the mayor, and the head of HR at the manufacturing company that builds boats in New York Mills met to develop a co-op in a public building where child care providers could come and run their business and create an economy of scale, to create child care that met the needs of that community that did shift work. They needed a little bit of bonding money. They needed a little bit of help from the Department of Economic Development, but couldn't get it. They needed to be treated like a small business and a co-op. They needed the rules twisted or bent just a little bit to allow them to proceed. That's where we can help. And when we think about child care, it is tied to employment, and it's tied to our economic well-being as families, and it's tied to the well-being of our kids. So we've got to get it right. But there isn't going to be one answer across the state. That part is clear to me. And I'm watching communities develop solutions that we have to pay attention to. So yes, for sure, we need to fund CCAP. There's a waiting list there, and that's unforgivable. But I think we have to listen to the people who are doing the work, who are struggling with some regulatory burden, also struggling with difficulty because the licensors are looking at things in different ways depending on who's looking. But first and foremost, the solutions going forward are going to come from the ground and from our communities, and that's where we're going to find our path forward.
Aaron, as governor, would you be committed to making sure this is taken care of?
We have to take care of it for our economic well-being, for the well-being of our children, and for our workforce. We already know we're short of workforce in manufacturing and healthcare and education. And if we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs to build our economy in the future, we got to make sure that people who want to work and can work. Child care is integral to that, yes.
Thanks. Okay, Jeff, ready for you.